Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Our top story: an insider says China's bird flu outbreaks is far worse than officially reported. This as the U.S. recorded its first death due to the disease. An expert explains how you can best protect yourself.
This includes making sure you're drinking pasteurized milk and dairy products because, as I mentioned, dairy cattle have been infected.
President Biden making it harder for China to obtain advanced American AI chips in his final week in office. Details on who the new restrictions are slated to hit. FBI Director Christopher Wray warning about Chinese infiltration into U.S. water treatment and telecommunication systems. Why he calls China the defining threat of our generation. And the University of Michigan cutting ties with a Chinese university. This after 5 of its Chinese graduates were charged with covering up visits to a U.S. military site in the dead of night. Before we dive into today's top story, we'd like to share an important update. You can now catch China in Focus on Genjing World every Tuesday instead of YouTube. We'll publish the link in the description box down below at that time, or you can search China in Focus at genjingworld.com. Reports of a bird flu outbreak are coming out of China. An insider working in China's disease monitoring sector told NTD the country is seeing over 100 cases of the infection, known as H5N1. By contrast, Chinese authorities placed the official tally of infections at just one single patient for H5N1. The Chinese regime has a history of covering up data on outbreaks and other disasters. H5N1 can become fatal in humans in some cases. The World Health Organization says the infection's fatality rate stands at over 50%. NTD has concealed the source's identity for safety concerns. The source told NTD that there are at least 100 infections of H5N1 in the country, and that Chinese authorities are building isolation facilities near some highways. The source warns that the virus is spreading widely inside of China and that the situation is almost out of control. The source expects adding public announcements about the outbreak will soon be made. Something to note, China's biggest city, Shanghai, announced it would suspend trading live poultry nationwide starting January 1st. The ban is slated to last 3 years. The source also condemned the regime for what they called a cover-up. The latest report from China's CDC website said it had only detected one case of H5N1 as of the end of November, which came from Vietnam. China CDC did not mention the virus in its report from the first week of 2025. A child in San Francisco had a probable case of H5N1 bird flu. The city's Department of Public Health says the child developed symptoms, including red eyes and a fever. Officials say the child did not need to be hospitalized and has recovered from the virus. Disease detectives don't know how the child was exposed, but they say there's no evidence the infection spread to anyone else. That case comes just as the U.S. recorded its first death due to bird flu last week in Louisiana. And how can the public protect against bird flu and who is at high risk? NTD's Melina Weisskopf tapped Dr. Saira Madad, a pathogens preparedness specialist, for insight.
Now, I also want to ask you, Doctor, about H5N1 or bird flu, which is now surging in poultry and dairy cows. What should we watch out for?
So H5N1 certainly, is making a lot of headlines, as it should be, because it is a concerning virus. But what's important is that we put everything into context. So first, with H5N1, it's very similar to what we just talked about with HMPV. It's not a new virus. We know a lot about it because we've seen it circulate for decades and decades. But what is concerning here, particularly in the United States, is that it started infecting dairy cattle in 2024, so just last year. And we're seeing the dairy industry, become impacted by this virus. Now, recently, we've had the first fatal case of H5N1 in the state of Louisiana. That doesn't necessarily change anything in terms of our risk factors, because we know that H5N1 can be deadly in certain individuals, and it has a history of being deadly. So far in the United States, we've seen over 67 cases across 10 states and a couple of other cases that are probable but not in that confirmed category. These are all sporadic cases cases, and over 99.9% have been linked to exposure to infected poultry or cattle. So we know that the exposure source is still animals. But we're starting to see some indication of these mutations. And so anytime a new human gets infected, it's always concerning because there's that risk of this virus mutating even further in this individual and creating that bingo card of mutations that will make it much more efficient in terms of spreading to human. Because it's not a new virus, we actually have some therapeutics and medical countermeasures already lined up for it. With H5N1, because it's been around for so long, we actually have a couple of candidate vaccines already in stockpiles in the United States. We have antiviral treatment that we know that works, but you all can certainly do things that can help reduce your risk. And this includes making sure you're drinking pasteurized milk and dairy products, because as I mentioned, dairy cattle have been infected. You want to make sure you're cooking your meat thoroughly, like poultry and beef, and other meat. You're washing your vegetables, as well. You're doing respiratory etiquette. You're covering your cough, your sneezes. And if you think you've been exposed to a infected animal or a dead animal and you've touched it, you want to make sure you're monitoring yourself and that you're contacting your provider to say, hey, I've been in contact with, an animal source that has died, and my child was in the backyard. I just want to make sure we can talk about this a little bit further. But the risk to the general public remains low. But if you're in that high risk category, like you're a farmer, you're a dairy worker, you're much more at risk because you're dealing with these infected sources. So the precautions there are different, which is making sure you're wearing PPE when you're dealing with these infected animals.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sai Ramadad. We really appreciate your input today. Thank you.
My pleasure.
President Biden's final effort to block China from advanced AI technology. In his final week in office, Biden put new restrictions on exports of U.S.-developed computer chips that power AI systems. The global export framework got announced Monday. It's an effort to keep advanced American technology out of adversaries' hands. The move creates 3 tiers of rules for exports of advanced AI chips and technology. There are no new restrictions for the first tier. Partner countries and allies like Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. A second tier of countries, including China and Russia, will face new limits on the sale of the most powerful closed AI models. That refers to models built on technology that isn't released to the public. The third group, which comprises most of the world, will soon have new caps on the amount of computing power that can be bought. Analysts have said this change is intended to prevent China from getting AI chips through third-party countries, particularly in the Middle East. The rules now enter a 120-day comment period, but will take effect before that period is over. Greenland's prime minister says he is ready to speak with President-elect Trump. This after Trump refused to rule out using military or economic means to take control of the Panama Canal and Greenland. He explains why the U.S. needs Greenland. Let's play that video.
We need it for national security. That's for the free world. I'm talking about protecting the free world. You don't even need binoculars. You look outside, you have China ships all over the place. You have Russian ships all over the place. We're not letting that happen.
Italian Premier Giorgia Meloni said she sees Trump's message as a warning to China.
Il canale di Panama.
The Panama Canal was built in the early 20th century by the United States. It is essential for the global market. It is essential, obviously, for the United States, for the connection between the two coasts, etc. Greenland is a particularly strategic territory close to the North Pole, rich in strategic raw materials. These are both territories in which in recent years we have witnessed a growing Chinese protagonism.
Greenland is rich in minerals and oil resources. It sits on the shortest route connecting North America and Europe and is governed by Denmark.
FBI Director Christopher Wray saying China is the greatest long-term threat facing the U.S. He added China is the defining threat of our generation. Here are the details from his exit interview that aired Sunday on 60 Minutes. Wray revealed China's cyber program has stolen more data from the U.S. than any other nation. Wray also says China has infiltrated critical infrastructure like water treatment and communication systems. He warned against lying in wait on those networks to, quote, be in a position to wreak havoc, and noted that they could, quote, inflict real-world harm at a time and place of their choosing. The University of Michigan is ending its partnership with a prominent Chinese university. This comes a few months after 5 Chinese students in the joint program were charged for suspicious activities outside a remote military site. The indictment traces back to an incident at Camp Grayling in August 2023 when the U.S. National Guard was hosting a training exercise with the Taiwanese military. According to the FBI, the group was caught snapping pictures of military equipment, but tried to cover their tracks when approached by authorities. Court filings did not reveal the suspects' whereabouts, but they have been charged with several offenses, from conspiracy to lying to authorities to destroying evidence during a federal investigation. The University of Michigan's president said while the university values economic international partnerships, it takes matters of national security very seriously and will better review visa requirements for international students. The U.S. vowing to deepen cooperation with Japan and the Philippines amid China's growing aggression in the South China Sea. Here's more.
President Biden spoke to the Japanese Prime Minister and the Philippine President virtually yesterday. The White House said they discussed China's dangerous behavior in the South China Sea, adding the leaders agreed on the importance of working together to advance a free Indo-Pacific. China has ramped up aggression in the South China Sea. Chinese Coast Guard vessels have rammed Filipino boats multiple times. More than 60% of global maritime trade passes through the South China Sea. Both Beijing and the Philippines claim the region. China claims almost all of the sea as its own territory, but an international court ruled China's claim invalid in 2016. Japan also has territorial disputes with China over the Senkaku Islands. Beijing says the Chinese military will send a delegation to Japan later this month to mend ties and step up defense exchanges.
Coming up, oil tanks heading to China and India have already dropped anchor after new U.S. sanctions targeting Russian oil took effect. What the sanctions mean for major oil buyers. A British Chancellor defends her China visit, which she says was to help reset economic relations. That's as Britain struggles with weakened currency and UK financial markets face turmoil amid dropping investor confidence. And satellite images revealed China has been building mobile piers that could aid possible Taiwan invasion. At the same time, the island is charging a growing number of alleged China spies. More on that after the break here on China in Focus. Welcome back to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. The price of oil reached a 4-month high on Monday after the U.S. announced its most harsh sanctions against Russia's oil industry late last week. Energy traders say the U.S. sanctions will push China and India to source oil elsewhere. The latest sanctions target 2 major Russian oil producers responsible for about 2/5 of the country's seaborne crude oil last year. It's worth noting China purchased over half of these oil exports. China and India claim to be the 2 biggest buyers of Russia's discounted oil. That said, the West altogether boycotted Russia's oil to put pressure on Moscow to stop the war on Ukraine. Since the sanctions were announced, at least 65 oil tankers have already stopped sailing. That's including those currently near China and Russia, according to a European data intelligence firm. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says the move will go after the Kremlin's key source of war funding. Britain's Chancellor returns from her trip to China, where she and her delegation of finance executives sought to deepen ties with Beijing. This as the UK's market faces growing turmoil in the face of dropping investor confidence. NTD's international correspondent Malcolm Hudson reports from London.
British Chancellor Rachel Reeves over the weekend struck a trade deal with Beijing worth some $730 million for the UK over the next 5 years. She's seeking to deepen economic ties with China amid a broader push by the new Labour government to reset relations with the Asian nation. But Reeves faced criticism for her trip as she left the UK amid market turmoil. Here she is speaking in China.
London's markets are unparalleled for their depth and openness. No other place in the world has the same concentration of banks, insurers, asset managers, advisors and legal services. We are a natural home for China's financial services firms.
She said London can be a launchpad for Chinese firms seeking to build a global footprint, adding that 40 Chinese financial institutions already have a foot in the UK. Reeves's trip comes amid market turmoil as the yield on UK government bonds reached a 17-year high. This increase means the British government pays higher interest payments on its debt and is also a sign of falling market confidence. The British Treasury said in a statement that the UK and China agreed to cooperation in areas such as financial services, trade, investment and the climate. Banking heads such as the Bank of England's Governor Andrew Bailey were part of Reeves's delegation. Bailey and other top executives from financial firms such as HSBC, Standard Chartered and the London Stock Exchange met with China's central bank head, seeking to deepen financial cooperation and business ties. The trip to China comes following Chinese spy allegations that surfaced last month, with one alleged spy having very close ties to British Prince Andrew and another cultivating relationships with British parliamentarians. It also comes in the lead-up to President-elect Trump's inauguration next week. Trump is expected to impose tariffs on all imports, including a 60% tariff on Chinese imports. The United States is the UK's biggest trading partner, while China is the UK's fourth biggest. Malcolm Hudson, NTD News, London.
China has been escalating efforts to seize control over Taiwan. According to the Financial Times, China is developing a new class of mobile piers at a shipyard near Taiwan. The construction project could signal preparations for a potential amphibious invasion. These piers are designed to stabilize landing gear and overcome the weaknesses of floating systems. They come in 3 sizes, with the largest measuring roughly 200 yards with a 140-yard ramp. Analysts note that these piers could transfer tanks and artilleries from the sea to land to Taiwan. On top of military advancements, Taiwan has seen a sharp rise in espionage cases linked to China. Over the weekend, Taiwan authorities reported that prosecutions for Chinese espionage have quadrupled, rising from 16 cases in 2021 to 64 in 2024. Many of those charged were active or former military personnel. Beijing has intensified efforts to infiltrate Taiwan's armed forces, often through bribery. Beyond military development and spying, China has ramped up economic and cultural pressure too. Counties in China's Fujian province near Taiwan have set up Taiwan affairs offices to increase cross-strait ties. South China Morning Post reports that Fujian also offers incentives for Taiwanese residents to cross over in fields like education and entrepreneurship. This initiative has been attracting Taiwanese entrepreneurs since the 1980s, but expanded province-wide in 2023. Earlier this month, a Chinese-linked vessel was suspected of cutting a Taiwanese undersea cable, the kind that carries the island's high-speed communications data and links it with the rest of the world. The incident has raised concerns of potential gray zone operations by China to hamper the island's communications with the outside world.
On January 3rd, a Chinese-linked cargo vessel came under suspicion for allegedly cutting a Taiwanese undersea cable. According to Taiwan's Coast Guard, the ship is owned by a Chinese company.
When we saw the ship, we contacted the cabin door, and from what we understood, all the crew members were Chinese nationals. This situation is rather puzzling because it's not the first time that China cut Taiwan's undersea cable.
The radar showed the vessel had passed by at the time the undersea cable was cut, and tracking data showed the ship's path included atypical behavior for a cargo vessel. This has raised concerns among Taiwanese authorities about China's gray zone operations, or unconventional warfare tactics. In particular, those that could hamper the island's communications with the outside world.
This is part of the Chinese Communist Party's gray zone operations against Taiwan. It creates inconvenience for the public in terms of communication, highlighting the perceived incompetence or mistakes made by the Taiwanese government to undermine people's trust toward the government.
If our cable is cut, how long would it take for us to restore it? What would we do while it's still severed? And if all of Taiwan's submarine cables were cut at the same time, how long would the impact last? And how significant would the losses be? This, cable cutting, would allow China to estimate the outcome.
Following this incident, another cargo ship lingered in an area for 5 days, where several undersea cables lay close to Taiwan. The ship flew a Mongolian flag but has Chinese origin. Taiwan authorities also said the ship shut down its broadcast system so no radar could detect it.
The United States and its allies performed joint defense exercises in Japan, the goal to prepare defenses and counter threats from neighboring communist countries. NTD's Jason Perry has the details.
Spectators in Japan looked on as multiple countries teamed up with the Japanese self-defense forces to perform joint defense exercises. On Sunday, paratroopers from the United States, Canada, the Philippines, and Japan jumped from military aircraft as part of the yearly exercise called the New Year Jump. Japan's Minister of Defense, Jin Nakatani, attended the joint exercise as well.
Our 1st Airborne Brigade is a very strong, highly capable unit that can respond quickly and swiftly. They undergo extremely rigorous training on a daily basis, and today's drill was the culmination of those trainings.
Nakatani also participated in the drills, taking a leap of faith from a practice jumping station for paratroopers in training. Meanwhile, Japan's Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya said on Sunday that he'll be attending President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration next week. Iwaya will be the first Japanese cabinet member to attend the swearing-in of a U.S. president. Jason Perry, NTD News.
Over in Ukraine, the country's president says they have more evidence of North Korea's involvement in the war. Ukraine Security Service spokesman explains.
The soldiers of Ukrainian Defense Forces have captured the first North Korean servicemen who fight for the Russian fascists in the Kursk region.
A video posted by the Security Service of Ukraine appears to show 2 captured men. One had his jaw bandaged due to an apparent wound, while the other was drinking through a straw. Entity could not independently verify the authenticity of the videos. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on X that their capture was not an easy task because Russian forces and other North Korean military personnel usually execute their wounded to erase any evidence of North Korea's involvement in the war against Ukraine. Kyiv and its Western allies say North Korean troops entered the war on Russia's side in October. It was initially estimated that 10,000 or more North Korean troops were deployed.
That's all for today's China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. If you have any feedback on the show or have something you'd like to see us cover, send us an email at chinainfocus@ntd.com. We'd love to hear from you. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com or download our NTD app. Thanks for watching. See you tomorrow.